Wonderful. So thank you guys so much for joining me and for doing this interview. If we could just start with an introduction, your name, your years on staff, your current role, as well as what your previous role is if you changed roles recently. Amy, could you get us started?
Yeah, sure. My name is Amy. Uh, I am, this is my fourth year on staff. That's so wild to think about. I feel like I've been on for I feel like I deserve a sabbatical at this point, but it's just year four. I am a CSM2 in Central and West Ohio. That's in the Rivers and Rails region. Also serve as the Asian American champion for Rivers and Rails and Michigan Lower Peninsula, or what used to be known as former Great Lakes East. I staff an Asian American chapter at Ohio State, a Black student chapter at Ohio State, and a multi-ethnic chapter at Miami University.
Great. And the Asian American chapter was the one, obviously, it was the Asian American Evangelism Project. So that was the one that
Yes,
where you were part of this evangelism project.
correct.
Thanks. Josh, introduce yourself for us.
Yes, hello or howdy. My name's Josh. I've been on staff. This is my 6th year now. I've been a CSM at Texas A&M University. This is now my 5th year, but this year just transitioned to a role where I'm part-time CSM, part-time production specialist for a region. But when this project was happening, full-time CSM with the Asian American students at Texas A&M. And yeah, I don't know if there was any other.
Nope, that was great.
Sweet.
Great. Thanks. And so, and Amy, just to I have it right, when we were doing the project, you were doing the Asian American chapter, but also staffing a multi-ethnic chapter at Miami University. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And then Josh, you were full-time at A&M.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we did an 18-month project. It actually ended up being 14 months, I think, because of the pandemic. And so we got, almost there, maybe 16 months. And the thesis of the project was centered around what does it look like to use collaboration with Asian American secular organizations as a way to foster chapter planting, chapter growth, evangelism, really, that sort of a thing. So first, if you guys could just share why you decided to apply for this evangelism project. The evangelism project, you applied in I think the fall of 2018 is right, because we did all of 2019 and the first half of 2020. So this was, almost just about 2 years ago when you decided, if you can think back 2 years to when you applied for this project. Kind of what was your thought process? What conversations were you having with your area director or superiors or coworkers, that sort of thing? Yeah, if you just tell us a little bit about your process and why you decided to apply for the project.
2 years ago. I'm trying to think about 2 months ago.
Yeah.
I think at the time, as I was staffing AAIV, one of the biggest things that was on my heart was to see a more complete picture of what Asian American ministries looks like. We have a lot of East Asian students, mostly church background East Asian students, but not a lot of Filipino students, not a lot of Southeast Asian students. And so there are larger campus orgs that have a lot of Filipino students, have a lot of Vietnamese students. And we were, feeling very strongly the chapter should be at a point at some point, it might not be there within the 18 months, but we want to take intentional steps to be a more, I guess a community that reflects more of the Asian American or the APIDA diaspora. And this seemed like a really great opportunity to get some coaching, to get some tips and insight on how to do that.
Great. Thanks, Amy. How about you?
Yeah, I think similar to what Josh was saying, my chapter is also a predominantly East Asian chapter, and I think we've been trying to have many conversations about how do we make our similar to what Josh said, more reflectant of what our diaspora looks like, not only for the sake of doing it for doing it, but helping our students see and fully imagine a deeper image of God's creation and God's intent in Asian American culture and the beauty in that, and also helping our East Asian American students like decentralize themselves from the conversation of what it means to follow Jesus as an Asian American. And so it's something that we've been trying to do in our chapter for a really long time already, but it just never really gained a lot of momentum because like no one wants to like leave the chapter to like go somewhere else or start something new. And so when I saw that this program was like a thing, I was like, oh snap, it could be cool to try it, and you can get some fun coaching. Shamelessly, I did it because there was money involved, and my MPD needed that. So, and it was just a win-win situation for everyone. So I was like, oh, let me just give it a try. So.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing that. So a couple of things that I heard then as a theme is that both of you recognized that your chapters were Asian American in name, but predominantly East Asian in makeup, and that there were these secular organizations, Asian American organizations on campus, multiple ones even, that had represented the diaspora more. And so this was an opportunity like, hey, we wanted to kind of get in there and actually have our chapter reflect the campus a little bit more. And the secular organization seemed like an easy or good way to be doing that. Now, Amy, you said that you had been trying this for it had been kind of a thing that the chapter had been trying for a while, and it never really got off the ground. Josh, was this something that was like a relatively new thing for your chapter, or was it also something like, hey, we've always talked about it, but this wasn't a good opportunity to go for it, or was it more like when the project came up, oh, this would be kind of sparked something?
So in my time at Texas A&M, I don't think there had been like any joint events or any sort of collaboration or partnership. And when I asked the question of like, have we done this before? If not, why not? And it usually came down to the question of, is it ministry related? And so even just shaping, like, not just saying like to have joint events, people are like, really, I think there was a discipleship that needed to happen of like what it meant to include a broader like picture of family, right? And family isn't just the people who look like us, have a similar skin tone as us, and grew up in similar churches as us, especially like down here in Texas. That's a very common experience, and that plays into like kind of what shaped the what is it, the project later down the road, with like denominational like comfort zones, and so with this, I thought it was a great opportunity, one, to just do a little more discipleship and expanding like, what does AIV actually stand for? And like, do we understand what all that comes with, more than just like a diversity of faces in the room, but the experiences and stories there.
Yeah, great. Like that, your chapters are different sizes, if I understand, right? So, Amy, you got roughly last year, as you were going through the project, what was the size of your chapter roughly?
Oh man, gotta check that AFR. I want to say we're consistently somewhere between like 50 and 60.
50 and 60. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. It's like a medium-sized chapter somewhere there. Josh, I think you guys are larger. Is that right?
Yeah, about 100 or so.
Okay.
Give or take.
Okay, great. And so in that, even if you have 50 students or 60 students, like there are a lot of, you have your leadership team and you have your core team, and there are all these decisions to be making. And so, Josh, you picked Alyssa to do the project with you. Amy, you had Zubin and Claire do the project with you as well. Could you guys talk a little bit about how you decided that Alyssa or that Zubin and Claire were going to be the one, you were going to invite them to do the project with you? Was it?
I feel like for my students, actually, it's so rough, like reliving this whole experience. I'm like, wow, because we changed our project like over 10 times. I feel bad, Adam, but it was like, oh, by the way, we have to change something else. Or like, oh, actually, this isn't working. But I started with Zubin. He had he had like been on an e-board of like a secular Asian org on campus, and so we thought that that could be a good like segue into something. But then he didn't stay on that e-board, and so we're like, well, there goes that. And he didn't have as much influence as I think I thought he did. And then we eventually got Claire in because Claire was interested, or she had certain connections, because she had done this like follow-up during NSO with a Malaysian student who seemed like he was interested in like talking about spirituality and stuff. And so we're like, oh, okay, maybe we'll do that. So we brought in Claire. So in terms of like trait-wise, I don't think I was like looking for anything particular. I just wanted it to be someone who was like willing to try something new and be like willing to kind of like do something that we haven't done before and like take that risk. So both Claire and Zubin are great, and they are like risk takers in certain conditions, I would say. But I think I would say like looking at them from, you said 2018, is that right?
Yeah.
Like to now, like they have definitely grown a lot. And I think a lot of it was their willingness to like to learn and like try new things, even if they weren't sure if it was going to work or not.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing. It sounds like, so for you then, it was a lot of it had to do with the relationships that were already present, right? Zubin was on this e-board with a secular organization, and Claire came on because she had done some NSO follow-up with someone who was on an e-board for the secular student organization. And so it kind of, and then you're like, okay, so there are connections there, but then also I know that they're willing to take risks, and I know that there's a little bit of that there. So it feels like that felt like that was a good kind of plunge to take with them. Josh, how about for you with Alyssa?
Yeah, so Alyssa was one of the first students that we had come out to our Southeast Asian Ministries plant, which had like started at the end of spring 2018. So it was like kind of in that time where she was getting more introduced to the community of AIV, but also like she had a genuine experience with Jesus, had this kind of like motivation to do something with her faith, but also as a Filipino woman who is also like a practicing Catholic, she's like, yeah, like there's not a lot of people like me here in AIV. And she had this heart, had this desire to like bring more people into this community. She's like, for her, she was like, I've loved what I've experienced here. And like, it's difficult at times, right? Being one of the only Catholic students in the ministry, but she knew that there was something that the Lord was like moving her to do in terms of caring for her friends, her just like her friends and the other secular orgs. And so for me, I was like, yeah, I do want to see more people like Alyssa in AIV, because like I've grown so much, even just like myself, like meeting with her and interacting with her. And I was like, I think this is the space that I want students to see. This is possible for all of us to be here in this space. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So it sounds like there was for Alyssa, at least, it was like there was a vision component to it, where she's like, hey, I have this vision, and you're like, well, here's a project that kind of lines up. So I think that's really cool that like a relationship and vision, they both have their places in making, being a willingness to kind of take the plunge and try something like this and reach out to secular organizations. Speaking of Alyssa and Zubin and Claire, I personally had a great time with them and coaching them and hanging out and doing all those things. If you guys could, as you think about them, what are some ways that you feel like they benefited from the project, or maybe what are their big takeaways from the project, whether it be risks that they took or new things that they learned or anything like that? Yeah. So for Josh, we'll have you start. But as you think about Alyssa, like what would you say were some of her big takeaways from the project, or ways you saw her grow?
I think just her confidence and feeling empowered, like by the ministry, right? Like the confidence she's shown from like, oh, like, do we want more Catholic students in AIV? To like, no, we absolutely like want them to feel welcome and like family, but also want our Protestant students to know what it's like to have family that comes from different kind of like, yeah, denominational backgrounds. And so for her, I definitely saw her confidence grow, not just in like the organization, but like in herself as a leader, um, as a carrier of the gospel. I got to see that grow. And yeah, I think that was huge to see kind of empowerment spoken into her throughout this whole process. Because especially since whoever started the group was an Asian American male, and for her to kind of step into quote unquote big shoes was like, for her, I feel a daunting task, especially since she was like, I'm still kind of fresh, still kind of new, but yeah, she's totally owned things up to this point. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, she did great. Also, I think about like with her in particular, it was like I remember the first time that we did a listening prayer
Mm.
with her, and she's like, "What is this?" And then listening prayer. It seemed like listening prayer was something
Yeah.
that really connected with her, and she was able to do that a few more times as well. Amy, how about for Zubin and Claire? What ways you saw them grow? What do you think? What would you say is probably their biggest takeaway?
I think for both of them, Adam, what you said, the point about listening prayer, I think that's something that we've been trying to like develop for a really long time. And I feel like students, especially students who come from like an immigrant church background that maybe can be a little more conservative, have trouble like really engaging with listening prayer because there's a lot of like fear of like, is this what I'm hearing? Or like, what's going on? And so like I know for Claire and Zubin, we're both like a little bit resistant toward it in the beginning, and we're just like, we don't really know, like we're not really sure. And I think they're great student leaders because they do a lot of like what you tell them to do, and they're very good at executing, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I really saw them grow in their reliance on the Spirit and them actually calling the shots, and not like waiting on me to call the shots, which I feel like was also a growth point for me to not call the shots, because I feel like I like to call the shots because I'm like, oh yeah, this is what you do, and giving them the space to like to try things that they wanted to try, I think was cool. And then I think because we ended up doing our group was with Kamai students, and just watching Claire and our Kamai student like actually create a genuine friendship and relationship out of that was, I feel like, maybe one of like the biggest things that came out of it, was realizing that like we can befriend people who are like not from our organization, and there are valuable relationships there as well. So.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing. You mentioned, Amy, a little bit about how even there was like some growth for you as well, like being able to give up control. And I think part of that too, like your projects, one of the things that I think we learned from the project side of things is that like it's okay to shift course as needed, because as there was the leanings from the Holy Spirit and Zubin and Claire kind of leading things and saying, hey, we feel like we need to move from the Malaysian students to the Khmer students, and the way they kind of unlocked some things and opened up doors was great. From a staff perspective, you said letting go of control. Question for both of you is, did you feel like, what were some of your big takeaways? Were the lessons that you learned about reaching secular organizations or your own staff development or those sorts of things that came from the project?
I mean, it's hard to really nail down, and I think that the answer that comes to mind is like, feels like an obvious one, but like relationship is so key. Like in the process of coaching them through a project, they are more than a project, and like I don't think we ever want to make students feel like they're a means to an end in terms of numbers and results. So I think there's, for me, the more direct element of walking with Alyssa, talking with her through very specific, kind of situations that were like, what does vision look like after this project is done, and to dream bigger and to allow the Lord to kind of take a hold of that vision. Like, while we may have had an idea in mind of why we're starting the project, what we wanted to see, I think there were points and conversations that Alyssa and I had that were like, the Lord is clearly like giving you something, like vision for something more outside of this project. And even if it doesn't fit our our AFR numbers, if it doesn't fit like our goals that we set in the beginning, that's so much more important. And to walk with Alyssa and say like, yeah, what does it look like to have a fellowship, not just for Southeast Asian students, but like Catholic student ministry, and like how are we discipling our students in navigating the difference as well. And so for me, it's like just being ready for whatever kind of comes of this project, because it didn't turn out to be just like, oh, and now our organizations have like amazing partnerships all the time. Like, we did have talk of joint NSO events or beginning of the year events when the semester was starting. But I think one of the most profound things that came out of it was like, oh, our leaders are learning how to navigate differences between Protestant and Catholic faith. We have two apprentices on our leadership team from our like Southeast Asian Ministries small group, and all three of those leaders are Catholic, Alyssa included. And so I don't know if that's something that we anticipated coming in, but the Lord definitely has been using that and has been kind of discipling us through that process together. So
very cool, very cool. Amy?
So I think like when I first saw the original project and the end goal being a collaborative event, I don't know, for me, I thought it was going to be easy. Like, of course, and I remember even talking about this with Zubin and Claire. We're like, oh yeah, we can put on a collaborative event like by the end of this month. And like, that does not seem difficult to do. But then as we started going to these calls with you, Adam, and realized a deeper like intentionality and like spirituality, if that makes sense, with it, I think we were like, oh, actually, we don't know if we would be able to do that. And in fact, that leading up to it part of discipleship seemed harder than putting on a collaborative event. And I don't know if that's just the way our school is or our organizations are like at our school, but it was not intimidating at all to do that. What was more intimidating was that discipleship of, this is why it's important to have this event, or to like the lead up to the collaborative event and the relationships there. And so I think I'm reminded about a lot of ministry is not like what you can crank out of your produce, but like the process and the discipleship that is needed to get there. And by the end of it, I feel like we got to that point of like creating that real relationship with Veronica. Veronica was the Kamai student. I'm sorry if I didn't mention that beforehand. Of having a relationship with her, caring for her like spiritual health, and just for her like well-being, like in general. And they eventually like came up with a great event in which they're going to cook food together and have like spiritual conversations together. And we were going to invite like the Kamai Student Association, AIV was going to be there, and other groups that were interested in like having a cooking night that also talked about like spirituality were going to be there. But because of COVID, like we obviously couldn't do it, which is annoying. But I think I saw them really try to see if they could take it online, which I feel like was super cool, seeing their like desire to still have that space, not for the sake of having it, but for the sake of their relationships and the discipleship that they had gone through, and that being a fruit of their discipleship. But we didn't get to do it, which is sad. But I would say that was like a big takeaway for me, like remembering the importance of that discipleship.
Great, thank you. Those are great. Those are great lessons for sure. Relationship and the development of relationship and flexibility and how important discipleship is. Those are great lessons. My last question for both of you: if you were to give advice to another Asian American staff who wants to, who says like, hey, we want the same things. We want our chapter to reflect more of the campus in terms of Asian American diaspora. And there are some secular organizations on campus, and we want to do something with them. We feel like that's a really great place for us to be exploring. What would be something that you would tell them? What's the best advice that you could give to a staff who wanted that for their chapter?
I think this is gonna sound like super cliche, but I think our time in like prayer and listening prayer actually did a lot of the heavy lifting of the work. And like, I feel in the beginning, I'm not gonna lie, I was a little annoyed by it. And I was like, oh, I gotta listen again, and they're still listening, and I don't know if it's doing anything. But I actually think that it did a lot of the work now that I look back on it. Like, it was super helpful. So even if like without this project, I think a great, really, really great starting point for thinking about reaching out to secular orgs is prayer, like doing listening prayer fervently and like just in a disciplined way, if that makes sense. Because it really did change our hearts. And then I think like talking to people, but I feel like, how do I say this? I think I was very fortunate because both Zubin and Claire are very like easy to talk to people, and they can like talk with anyone. So those social skills and stuff came really easy to them, so they didn't really have trouble with doing that. But I think like that heart change needed to happen for them in order to go about that. So if you have students like that, I would say working on that, the heart aspect is really important.
Yeah, I think just discipleship and training on vision of this isn't just doing collaborative events just to do them, just to be like, oh my gosh, we did collaboration events, or you know, it's so much deeper than that. And the advice is like, I feel like even just before the project, there's got to be groundwork laid for them to understand why their story is important, and then I think that helps them understand why other people's stories are important. Because if they just see this as like, I mean, we're Asian American, but we go to church, we love Jesus. Like, what more to that is there? And so I think there was a lot of groundwork that needed to be done of why your ethnicity is important, and why it's important to hear from people of different experiences, and that Asian Americans are not just this monolith, but it's this beautiful tapestry of experiences and stories. And there's heartbreak, there's triumph, there's a lot there, but we don't capture all that. And I think, I don't know, I'm just a stories guy, and I know that like through a collective ownership of these stories, that's how we see Jesus clearer. And so I would say I would probably hit that harder for myself, like if I were to do it again another round. But that's what I would say.
Yeah, thanks for that. It sounds like a big theme or connection for the both of you is that there's a lot of internal work that goes, like, it's actually, I mean, Amy, you even said this, right? Like, we could have put out a collaborative event in a month. It wouldn't have been that hard to do the event itself, but for there to be real impact, it requires that pre-work of knowing your own story and hearing from Jesus, and what does it mean to actually follow. Do I see this as a discipleship thing? Do I see this as a relationship thing? Like, how do we do all those things? So that's great. That's a great word to end. So thank you both for being a part of the project. Thank you for sacrificing your time and the risk that you guys took and whatnot. And it was a pleasure working with you both, and also with your students. And yeah, so thanks for everything.
Thank you, Adam. We feel
Thank
likewise.
you.